Let's be honest. It's not how kind you are, it's not how deeply you care, and it's definitely not about how much effort you put in to be seen, heard, or loved. You can give someone your calm, your chaos, your time, your silence. You can stay up late listening, show up when no one else does, even shrink yourself to fit the space they have for you, and still they walk away as if none of it ever mattered, not because you're not worthy, but because something inside them was never moved. Real love, the kind that roots itself in the soul, doesn't ignite through comfort or consistency. It's triggered by something far more rare, something silent, psychological, and invisible. And until that moment happens, no amount of giving will ever be enough. If you're ready to stop chasing and start becoming, please subscribe. For you, for the self you're becoming, and the stillness that's been waiting to meet you. It's tempting to believe that if you just show up every day, if you remain consistent, patient, warm, they will eventually see your worth. That if you stay long enough, love will grow from familiarity. But this is one of the great illusions most people carry into relationships. The idea that presence, by itself, creates meaning. It doesn't. Presence without emotional impact is background noise. Always there, but never truly felt. You can be sitting right next to someone and still feel invisible. You can speak with kindness and still be ignored. What people remember isn't that you were around, but how you made them feel when you were. Love doesn't blossom from consistency alone. It begins in the moment someone feels changed, seen, stirred, even confused by your existence. Carl Jung captured this perfectly when he said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." This isn't about entertainment or attraction. It's about transformation. When someone leaves a conversation with you and sees themselves or the world differently, that's when a connection begins to matter. That's when presence becomes power. But what most people do is settle for being reliable. They think love is earned by being the one who never leaves, the one who always listens, the one who waits. And yes, reliability is beautiful, it's noble, but it's not magnetic. You can be steady and still be forgotten. You can be available and still be overlooked. There is a quiet tragedy in being the one who's always there while never being truly seen. The heart doesn't respond to repetition, it responds to meaning. When you stop asking, "Am I enough because I'm still here?" and start asking, "What does my presence awaken?" you begin to reclaim your emotional value. Emotional impact isn't loud. It's not about dramatic gestures or constant intensity. It's often subtle, an idea you planted without knowing it, a calm they feel only in your silence, a moment where they see a better version of themselves reflected in your eyes. But the moment your presence becomes a convenience rather than a catalyst, the relationship starts to decay. You're no longer someone who stirs the soul. You've become a piece of the furniture, familiar, useful, and taken for granted. This is why Stoic philosophy reminds us to be deliberate in how we show up. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good person should be. Be one but to truly be, in a world that encourages endless doing, is a quiet form of rebellion. To be someone who speaks less but is felt more. To create a stillness so rare that it disrupts the noise in others. That's what people remember, not your availability, but your effect." The mistake most people make is believing that availability equals value. That by always being the one who picks up the phone, who checks in, who forgives quickly and asks for little, they will eventually earn love. But love isn't something to be collected through loyalty points. It's not a reward for endurance. It's a recognition of something sacred. And sacredness requires space, not saturation. When you give too much without being truly received, you slowly become invisible, not because you lack worth, but because your presence has no contrast. Like a song on repeat, eventually, even the most beautiful melody becomes background noise. Impact requires edges. It requires you to not always say yes. It demands you take up space, speak your truth, and stop smoothing out your rough parts just to keep the peace. Being felt often means being a little disruptive, not with conflict but with clarity. When someone knows that your presence brings insight, not just comfort, that your silence is thoughtful, not passive, they begin to feel you in rooms you're not even in. That's the kind of presence that lingers. That's what makes someone unforgettable. Seneca once said, "A gift consists not in what is done or given, but in the intention of the giver." And the most powerful intention you can carry is awareness, being awake to the fact that your energy has weight, that the way you walk into a space, the way you speak to someone, the way you choose to step back or lean in, all of it shapes how others experience you. Don't mistake silence for irrelevance. Don't confuse stillness with absence. The most grounded people often create the deepest impact, not because they fight to be heard, but because they've become impossible to ignore. So if you've been showing up day after day, wondering why it still feels like you don't matter, stop. Don't give more to prove your worth. Give differently. Let your presence be intentional. Let your absence have consequence. Let your words carry thought, and your quiet carry strength. You're not here to be tolerated. You're here to be felt. And if someone doesn't notice the difference when you leave, they never truly saw the value in you when you stayed. From a young age, most of us are handed a script. Do good, be good, give your best, and eventually you'll be loved. We carry that script into relationships without ever questioning its weight. So we perform, we overextend, we make ourselves available, agreeable, adaptable. We adjust our rhythm to theirs. We anticipate needs before they're spoken, not because we're trying to manipulate, but because deep down, we believe love must be earned. We believe that if we show just how much we're willing to give, we'll finally be chosen. But that belief, however noble it feels, is quietly damaging, because it assumes that love is a transaction, effort in, affection out. And yet, the deeper part of a person, the unconscious, doesn't respond to effort. It doesn't calculate what you've done. It responds to meaning, and meaning cannot be manufactured through performance. There is a moment, rare and hard to describe, when someone looks at you and something shifts inside them. Not because you said the right thing, not because you offered the perfect support at the perfect time, but because something in your presence touched something in them they didn't know was there. You awakened a reflection, not with your actions, but with your being. That's what the unconscious responds to. Carl Jung called this the symbolic life, the space where we don't just interact with others, but with the parts of ourselves that have been long buried. When someone sees you and sees themselves more clearly through you, that's when attachment begins. Not because of your sacrifices, but because of your symbolism. The pain comes when you give everything, your time, your heart, your peace, and it still feels like you're on the outside looking in. You wonder, what more could I have done? But the truth is, doing more wouldn't have mattered, because the unconscious isn't impressed by effort. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't remember who texted first or who stayed up late listening. It remembers the impact. It remembers the quiet moment someone said something that shattered a belief you didn't know you were carrying. It remembers the person who walked into your life and made the silence feel different. That's not something you can strategize. That's not something you can earn. Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." But what happens when who you want to be is constantly shaped by the desire to be wanted. When every gesture is born from the fear of being forgotten, you lose the self that creates the very energy people fall in love with. You become a performer in your own life, slowly forgetting your own lines. And the tragedy is, even if they choose you, they're not choosing the real you. They're choosing the version of you thought they would like, and even that won't last, because eventually they'll feel the absence of depth, not because you lack depth, but because you hid it behind usefulness. You cannot become unforgettable by trying to be unforgettable. You become unforgettable by being undeniable. And being undeniable has nothing to do with being perfect. It has to do with being true. When someone feels they can't replace what you make them feel, not because it's grand or dramatic, but because it's real, something wakes up inside them. That waking is not the result of your hard work. It's the result of resonance, like a song they didn't know they loved until they heard it again in your silence. Most people confuse admiration with love, but admiration lives in the conscious mind. It's tied to what we see. Love, especially the deep kind, forms in the shadows, in the spaces we don't talk about, in the way someone makes us feel less alone in our chaos, in the way their voice quiets the storm inside, in the way they make us pause before continuing our usual patterns. The unconscious doesn't care how many compliments you give or how many sacrifices you make. It only cares if something moves. And the only way to move someone is to first be rooted in your own stillness. You can't awaken something real in someone else if you're constantly trying to edit yourself into someone lovable. That's not connection. That's survival. And survival has no room for magic. So if you've been giving, hoping, waiting, stop. Not because your effort is meaningless, but because the part of them that decides who to love was never watching your effort. It was waiting for something it couldn't explain, something that doesn't come when you bend over backwards, but when you finally stand still and let them feel you. The truth is, you can't earn the unconscious, but you can meet it when you stop performing and start existing, when you stop chasing meaning and become it. There's a quiet shift that happens in certain relationships, a moment so soft you almost miss it, but its impact is unforgettable. It's not caused by words or grand gestures. It doesn't come from effort or performance. It's deeper than attraction, more enduring than desire. It's that moment when someone begins to associate your presence with something within themselves, not because you filled a void, not because you completed them, but because you activated something real, something they had forgotten or maybe never even met before. In that instant, you stop being a person they enjoy and become a person who matters. And the fear of losing you doesn't feel like losing company. It feels like losing a part of who they are trying to become. That's what Carl Jung called individuation, the unfolding of the true self. And for many people, that process doesn't begin until they stand in front of someone who doesn't just love them, but reflects them. Most people think relationships are about completion, that the right person will fill the gaps, balance the weaknesses, and make everything feel whole. But that's a story we've been sold in movies and fairy tales. In reality, no one can complete you. And when someone tries, the relationship often becomes a dependency disguised as love. True connection isn't about completion, it's about reflection. It's about being seen so clearly that you begin to see yourself more clearly. It's subtle, but powerful. Because the more you see yourself through the lens of someone who mirrors your depth, the less you can tolerate anything shallow. That's when meaning becomes the trigger, not effort, not consistency, but the symbolic power someone holds in your life because they reflect a version of you that feels undeniably real. This is why certain people are unforgettable, not because of what they did, but because of what they meant. Their presence awakened your values. their silence made you question your patterns. Their words echoed long after the conversation ended. They didn't just give you comfort, they created tension, the good kind, the kind that makes you stop and examine what you truly want, who you really are, and who you're still afraid to become. That's not dependency, that's transformation. That's what it feels like when someone becomes a mirror instead of a mask. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou wilt ever dig." But the truth is, many people don't start digging until someone hands them the shovel, until someone walks into their life and reflects a version of them that feels like home, not because it's easy, but because it's true. That's the kind of relationship that becomes unforgettable, not because it was perfect, but because it was meaningful. It pushed them toward themselves, and the unconscious remembers that. What makes this so rare is that most people aren't anchored in themselves deeply enough to become this mirror for others. They're too busy performing, adjusting, chasing acceptance. But when you stop needing to be liked and start living in alignment with who you truly are, your presence gains weight. You no longer enter rooms trying to impress. You simply are, and that stillness challenges people. It reveals what they've ignored. And that revelation, the feeling that something has been uncovered in your presence, is what sparks the internal shift that no performance can replicate. There's a reason why some people are instantly respected without demanding it, why some people's silence feels heavier than another's loudest voice. It's because their presence carries meaning. They don't just walk into a conversation, they walk into someone's unconscious. They become the trigger for change, not by forcing it, but by reflecting it. You become the kind of person who makes others feel the contrast, the difference between emotional noise and emotional depth. That contrast is what makes your presence unforgettable. Because once someone feels that shift, they can't go back to how things were. They can't look at you the same way. And they can't look at themselves the same way either. Seneca once said, "Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power." That's exactly what you gift someone when you mirror back their own strength, their buried fears, their untapped longing. You give them the chance to meet themselves. And that is more valuable than any affection you could offer, because it doesn't fade with distance. It stays with them in silence. It lingers in moments when they're alone, and it calls them toward the version of themselves they were becoming when you stood beside them. So many people give everything, attention, affection, support, but never become meaningful, not because they lacked love, but because their love lacked reflection. If you want to be remembered, not just liked, don't focus on being perfect. Focus on being anchored. The more real you are with yourself, the more your presence will naturally reflect what others have been trying to ignore in themselves. And when that happens, when someone feels they are closer to their truth just by being near you, they don't just want you, they need what you represent, not because you complete them, but because you remind them of who they were always meant to become. There's a strange truth most people discover too late. Being needed doesn't guarantee being loved. In fact, the more you shape yourself around someone's needs, the more invisible you can become to their heart. At first, it feels like connection. You step in when they're struggling. You anticipate what they lack. You become their rock, their listener, their guide. But slowly, without realizing it, the relationship shifts. You're no longer someone they see. You're someone they lean on. And over time, that leaning becomes expectation. It becomes comfort. It becomes dependency. And in the mind of the one receiving, comfort rarely transforms into reverence. What you give becomes routine. What you offer becomes background. The more useful you are, the less magical you feel. Because usefulness isn't what triggers love, significance does. Being needed is a form of transaction. It says, I am valuable because I solve problems. I am worthy because I make your life easier. And while that may build attachment, it rarely builds depth. There's a difference between someone staying with you because life runs smoother when you're around, and someone staying because your presence stirs something sacred inside them. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But when your energy is constantly shaped by someone else's lack, you lose that privilege. You start performing usefulness instead of expressing essence. You lose your reflection in the mirror of their comfort. Love doesn't arise from dependency. It arises from contribution, not what you give, but what your presence inspires. When someone feels they matter to you, not because you depend on them, but because they make a meaningful difference in your inner world, an emotional bond forms that is stronger than any obligation. The feeling that I'm not just tolerated here, I bring something no one else can. That's the root of emotional investment. That's what makes someone show up fully, not out of guilt, but out of value. And value isn't born from how much someone needs you. It's born from how much they feel you. You might think that pouring yourself into another person, anticipating their needs, and being constantly available is the path to closeness. But often, it backfires. When someone feels like you need them to stay, the emotional space becomes suffocating. Love begins to feel like a job, presence begins to feel like a favor, and the connection, instead of deepening, becomes a responsibility they grow tired of carrying. But when you create space for someone to bring themselves into your life, not to fix you, not to rescue you, but to contribute something real, that's where intimacy begins. Epictetus wrote, "He who is not master of himself is not free." If you are constantly adjusting yourself to be useful, you aren't free. You're performing to avoid loss. You're clinging to roles that were never yours to begin with. And worst of all, you're teaching people that you only have worth when you're giving, that your presence is only justified when it serves a function. But love, true, sustaining love, is not built on function. It's built on impact. It's built on those moments when someone realizes that their place in your life is not a convenience, but a choice. That if they left, they wouldn't just leave a helper behind. They'd lose a mirror, a voice, a light. It's a difficult truth to swallow, especially if you were raised to believe that love is proven through sacrifice, that the more you give, the more you should be valued. But the people we hold closest in life are not always the ones who helped us the most. They're the ones who made us feel something we couldn't feel alone. They're the ones who helped us grow, not by doing everything for us, but by making us feel alive in their presence. The mistake we often make is thinking that love is built by filling another person's gaps. But real love isn't about becoming someone's missing piece. It's about being a whole presence that makes their life richer, not easier, richer. Seneca once said, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." That's how connection deepens, not through need, but through mutual elevation. When both people feel they are better because of each other, not rescued, not fixed, but inspired, a relationship takes on depth. You no longer feel like a role you have to maintain. You feel like a person, whole, vibrant, and irreplaceable. And from that space, the bond that forms is not one of obligation, but of genuine emotional gravity. So if you found yourself wondering why, despite doing everything, they still seem distant, take a step back. Ask yourself, am I being loved for who I am, or for what I provide? Is my presence valued when I offer nothing but myself? When you no longer have to be needed in order to feel secure, you begin to understand the kind of love that endures. One that doesn't fade when you stop trying. One that doesn't disappear when you stop performing. One that remains, not because you held them together, but because you matter, even in your silence. In the end, the irony is this: The less you try to be needed, the more you give others a chance to feel needed in return. And in that space of mutual contribution, not codependence, real bonding begins. Because when someone feels that they bring something valuable into your life, they stop running. They start building. Not because you need them, but because they finally feel like they matter. You can meet someone who ticks every box. You get along. You laugh at the same things. You enjoy the same books, order the same coffee, finish each other's thoughts. It's easy, familiar, comfortable, and still something feels hollow. Because compatibility, no matter how smooth or aligned it seems, is not what creates lasting connection. It's not what makes someone stay. True closeness, the kind that roots itself deep in someone's psyche, requires more than shared preferences. It requires emotional significance. That feeling that your presence touches something in them they didn't know needed to be touched. That you don't just match their rhythm, you awaken their soul. And without that, everything else, no matter how ideal on paper, eventually fades. Compatibility is like surface tension. It holds for a while, but it doesn't anchor anything. It creates harmony, but not heat. You might feel seen in the obvious ways, your opinions echoed, your habits mirrored, but emotional significance is different. It's what happens when someone begins to associate you not just with who they are, but with who they are becoming. It's not logical, it's not measurable. It's a pull that doesn't make sense until it's gone. And once they feel that pull, they can't unfeel it. That's the difference between someone choosing to stay and someone realizing they can't leave without losing something that now feels essential. Carl Jung spoke to this truth when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But what he didn't say, yet deeply implied, is that sometimes it takes another person to make us even see what we are rejecting in ourselves. Emotional significance isn't about being impressive. It's about being a mirror. A quiet force that reflects the parts of someone they've hidden, suppressed, or neglected. When someone senses that your presence helps them accept or confront a truth about themselves, that's when you become significant, not as a partner or companion, but as a symbol. And symbols are not easy to walk away from. There's a reason why people can forget those they were most compatible with, yet never get over someone who cracked something open inside them. You might not have made perfect sense together. You might not have had the same plans or timelines, but you mattered in a way that no routine or shared hobby ever could. You became part of their emotional vocabulary. And once someone becomes emotionally significant, it doesn't matter how many options exist. No one else speaks that language quite the same way. That's why love isn't a product of alignment. It's a consequence of meaning. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." And one of the most tragic ways we waste time is by trying to build long-term connection on short-term compatibility. We look for someone who fits into our schedule, our values, our lifestyle, and we forget that none of those things matter if the feeling isn't there. If someone doesn't feel emotionally moved by you, they will eventually find a way to leave, even if everything else lines up perfectly. Because people don't choose based on logic, they choose based on impact. That's the part no dating advice ever really teaches, that what keeps someone up at night thinking about you isn't how well your values align. It's the way you made them feel something unfamiliar, something they didn't expect. You introduced them to a version of themselves they hadn't met yet. You stirred the emotional waters that had been still for too long. You didn't just listen to them, you understood them in a way that felt dangerous and comforting at the same time. That's what creates a bond that doesn't break easily. And yet we spend so much time trying to be agreeable, trying to prove we're easy to be with. We downplay our complexity. We smooth our edges. We hold back our truth in favor of keeping things light. But emotional significance doesn't come from being agreeable. It comes from being real, from being grounded in your own story and letting that truth vibrate through the way you speak, the way you look, the way you hold space. When someone senses that energy, they don't just see a person, they see a threshold, a turning point. And that's unforgettable. The hard part is, you can't fake this. You can't create emotional significance by trying to be important. It has to be real. You have to become significant by becoming someone who doesn't hide their depth in exchange for attention. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." The more you live honestly, thinking, speaking, acting from your center, the more your presence becomes a catalyst for others to do the same. And that's what makes you emotionally powerful. Not your looks, not your charm, not your compatibility, but your clarity. So if you've ever felt like you did everything right and still got left behind, maybe it's not because something was wrong with you. Maybe it's because they never felt that inner shift. Maybe you made sense, but you didn't shake something loose. Maybe they saw a good person, but they didn't see themselves in you. And maybe that's not your fault, because you can't control whether someone is ready to be moved. You can only control whether you show up as someone who carries meaning, not just comfort. In the end, people stay where they feel alive, where they feel seen in ways that challenge and grow them, where the connection doesn't just fit, but expands them. And you become that kind of presence when you stop chasing compatibility and start embodying depth. Not because it gets you chosen, but because it's who you are. And when someone finally sees that, not just sees you, but sees themselves through you, they don't let go. Because what you trigger becomes bigger than you. It becomes a part of their story. We often put all our energy into being present, into showing up, being reliable, being seen. We believe that if we're available enough, generous enough, consistent enough, someone will finally recognize our worth. So we stay, we give, we pour ourselves into another person, hoping that presence will eventually translate into value. But presence alone doesn't define your power. What defines it is absence, the kind that doesn't just leave a space, but leaves an echo. When you step away, does the air shift, or do things carry on like you were never there? That question tells you everything, because when your absence goes unnoticed, your presence was never truly felt. Most people, when faced with emotional distance, respond by leaning in harder. They give more. They communicate more. They fill the silence with noise, afraid of what it might mean. But sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to love louder. It's to go quiet, to step back without drama, to remove your energy from a place that stopped respecting it. Because space is revealing. It shows you what your presence truly meant. And if they can breathe just as easily without you, if nothing shifts in your silence, then what you brought was comfort, not impact. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This couldn't be truer in the realm of relationships. Sometimes your withdrawal is what brings the unconscious to light. It's only when you're no longer there that someone begins to feel the weight of what you carried. The quiet mornings feel colder. The conversations feel flatter. Life, though it continues, feels incomplete, and they can't explain why, because it's not logical. It's emotional. It's unconscious. That's the difference between being liked and being missed. One disappears easily, the other lingers. We tend to underestimate the value of emotional contrast. In a world of constant connection, people rarely get the chance to feel the absence of another person. But contrast is what reveals substance. A sweet moment is only sweet because we know the taste of bitterness. Light feels warm because we've stood in shadow. The same goes for human connection. If your presence doesn't create contrast, then your absence won't either. And that's where many people misunderstand their own value. They assume that being everything to someone means being irreplaceable. But true irreplaceability isn't built on how much you give. It's built on the void you leave when you take it away. There's a silence that hurts, not because it's empty, but because it used to be full. And when someone feels that kind of silence after you're gone, they don't just remember your words or your actions. They remember the feeling of being seen, understood, grounded. That's what becomes unbearable. That's when they realize it wasn't about convenience or companionship. It was about meaning. Epictetus once wrote, "He who is not aware of what he is cannot be what he should be." That awareness often comes through absence, through missing the energy that once made everything feel a little more clear, a little more alive. When you carry emotional weight, your presence doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It doesn't need constant affirmation. It simply is. And when you're gone, it leaves behind an ache that doesn't ask for attention. It demands reflection. They sit with themselves and wonder, why does everything feel different now? And that's when the mind meets the heart. That's when the unconscious speaks. That's when they realize you weren't just a person. You were a turning point, a reference, a quiet force they underestimated until it was no longer available. And yet, many people never allow that silence to happen. They keep returning, filling gaps, making themselves available, so the other person never has to feel the full weight of their absence. But in doing that, they rob themselves of their own power. Because power isn't in being needed, it's in being felt when you're no longer trying. You deserve to be felt in your silence, to be remembered not for the favors you did or the words you said, but for the way your presence shaped the room, for the stability, the insight, the quiet depth you brought. And the only way someone can ever come to that realization is when you stop reminding them, when you stop showing up out of habit and start honoring your energy like it's worth protecting, because it is. The moment someone notices what life feels like without you, and that feeling hurts, that's when they wake up. Not when you give more, not when you explain your worth, but when the echo of your absence lingers long enough to speak the truth. The truth that you mattered in a way no surface interaction could ever replicate. You mattered, not because you were available, but because you were alive in the spaces between their thoughts. That kind of presence can't be faked, and that kind of absence can't be forgotten. There's a deep misunderstanding in how people think connection is built. We're often taught to show our best selves, to impress, to perform, to be everything someone else might want. But people don't fall in love with that version. Not truly. What they fall in love with isn't how perfect you are, how pleasing, how accomplished. They fall in love with the way they feel about themselves when they're around you. That feeling of being more real, more grounded, more them. Not because you're putting on a show, but because your presence allows them to take off their mask. Carl Jung spoke of this when he described the psychological mirror, not someone who completes you, but someone who reflects you back to yourself, clearly and without distortion. That mirror isn't found in admiration, it's found in revelation, and that's what people never forget. It's easy to fall into the trap of trying to be impressive. You want to be liked, you want to be remembered, so you highlight your strengths, downplay your struggles, make everything look smooth. But in doing so, you create distance, not connection, because the person in front of you isn't responding to you. They're responding to the role you're playing, and roles are replaceable. They're familiar, safe. But what's unforgettable isn't the character someone plays. It's the feeling someone leaves behind. That unspoken shift inside when the room goes quiet and something in you feels seen, not for who you try to be, but for who you already are. When someone feels that their true self emerges in your presence, something profound happens. The bond forms below the surface, in the unconscious. They might not be able to explain it, but they know. They know that with you, their guard drops a little, their thoughts make more sense, their dreams feel closer, their fears feel safer to speak aloud, and they begin to associate that clarity with you, that feeling of being more alive, more authentic, more themselves. That's the energy that creates emotional gravity. That's when a connection stops being casual and starts becoming irreplaceable. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But it's in the presence of certain people that self-knowledge becomes possible. You don't discover yourself in a vacuum. You discover yourself in reflection, in interaction. When someone sees you not through the lens of judgment or expectation, but through a deep, curious awareness, your identity begins to stretch, and the person who gave you that mirror, even unintentionally, becomes a turning point in your life. That's the kind of love that doesn't just feel good, it feels transformational. But that kind of connection only grows in real soil. It doesn't survive where there's performance, pretense, or emotional masking. When someone has to impress you to feel worthy, or when they feel they're being watched more than they're being understood, their nervous system never fully relaxes. And without that inner ease, the bond never deepens. It just hovers on the surface, pleasant, functional, but never truly soul-stirring. People walk away from those connections not because something was wrong, but because something was missing. That missing piece is usually the space to just be. There's a difference between being loved for what you do and being loved for what you are. One is conditional, the other is timeless. Seneca once wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor." That craving for recognition, for validation, for affection, never really ends when we keep performing for love. Because even if we receive it, we always fear losing it. True peace comes when we know the love is not for the version we polished, but for the self we allowed to emerge. And even more than that, for the self we helped them uncover. The people we never forget are rarely the ones who had it all together. They're the ones who made us feel more ourselves, who helped us access a clarity, a strength, or a softness we didn't fully own before. We tie their names to moments of awakening. That's what Jung meant by the mirror, when someone becomes a symbolic moment in your process of becoming. Not because they gave you advice or solutions, but because they stood there, real and open, and allowed you to do the same. You don't have to be everything to be enough. You just have to be honest, grounded, whole in your truth, because that's what becomes a mirror to others. The more real you are, the more others feel invited to drop the weight they've been carrying. And that's what creates emotional impact, not charm, not perfection, but authenticity. A presence that makes someone feel like they can finally stop pretending. Like they're home, not because of where they are, but because of who they are in your presence. The irony is, when you stop trying to be unforgettable and start being undeniably yourself, that's when you become the person they can't forget. Not because you were impressive, but because they liked who they were when they were with you. That kind of reflection doesn't fade with time. It stays etched in memory, in the deep recesses of the heart, where identity and intimacy intertwine. And when you reach someone there, not just through what you say, but through how you see them, you don't have to chase their attention. You become a part of who they are. And that's not love built on roles. That's love rooted in revelation. There's a strange paradox at the core of deep connection. The more you chase it, the further it drifts. The more you try to control how someone sees you, the less they actually feel you. You can pour your energy into being understood, into proving your value, into making sure they never forget what you offer, but none of that guarantees impact. Emotional significance isn't something you can earn through effort or effortlessness. It doesn't respond to pressure, only presence. The kind of presence that arises not from trying harder, but from finally letting go. Not as a strategy, not as reverse psychology, but as a return to self. That's where everything changes. People feel you most when you're not forcing them to, when your presence no longer asks to be validated, when you're no longer performing to be chosen, but embodying the fact that you've already chosen yourself. It sounds simple, but it's the hardest shift most people will ever make, because it means releasing the very thing your nervous system clings to for safety, the need to control how you're perceived. We spend years shaping ourselves to be desirable, palatable, acceptable. But desire doesn't live there. Not the kind that roots itself in the soul. That kind only awakens when someone feels they're not just witnessing your presence. They're being invited into it, without demand, without expectation, without pressure. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." And in relationships, what we often resist most is surrender. The idea that not doing more could actually be the most powerful thing we offer feels like a threat. But when you finally stop trying to be chosen and start simply being, your energy shifts. It becomes quiet, but heavy, still, but charged. You walk into a room, and even without saying a word, people feel something. That's not charisma, that's alignment. You've stopped asking for permission to be seen, and because of that, your presence becomes unforgettable. You don't have to convince someone to value what they already feel. If someone needs constant reminders of what you bring, they're not the one who's blind, you're the one who's still explaining. The truth is, when someone truly feels your significance, no explanation is needed. No performance is required. No pursuit is necessary. And oddly enough, it's that freedom from control that makes your energy magnetic. In a world where most people are trying to prove, the one who doesn't stands out. They become a symbol, not of arrogance, but of wholeness. This is what makes emotional impact so unpredictable. It shows up when you stop waiting for it to happen, when you release your grip on the outcome and trust that whatever is real will remain. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Look well into thyself. There is a source of strength which will always spring up if thou wilt always look. That source is your grounded presence. When you know who you are, not in a performative, polished way, but in a raw, unshakable way, you stop leaking energy into people who don't know how to hold it. And that containment, that deep, still inner knowing, is felt far beyond anything you could say or do." Most people confuse letting go with giving up. But letting go isn't walking away. It's standing still, refusing to shrink, refusing to chase, and allowing your silence to say what your effort never could. Because when you let go of trying to be chosen, you give others the space to realize they want to choose you. And if they don't, that's clarity, not loss. You didn't lose someone. You lost a story you were telling yourself about what your value depends on. And that's a liberation, not a rejection. You can't force someone to see meaning in your presence. You can't manipulate someone into feeling depth. But you can hold your own energy in such a grounded way that if someone is ready, they'll feel it the moment they stand near you. They'll feel the contrast, the difference between you and everyone else who needs to be needed. You're not here to prove you matter. You're here to embody it. And when you do, you stop being just another person in the crowd. You become a signal, a mirror, a presence that lingers long after you've left the room. Plato once wrote, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." And in the world of relationships, real power is restraint. The restraint to not beg, the strength to not force, the courage to not chase, to allow someone the space to either meet you in truth or not, and to remain centered either way. That kind of stillness has gravity. It pulls people toward it. Not because of tactics or charm, but because it reflects something they want to become. Your presence becomes aspirational, not in ego, but in energy. You represent peace in a world full of noise. So here's the paradox that lives at the center of it all. You only become emotionally significant when you stop trying to be, when you stop grasping, explaining, adjusting, and simply exist in the fullness of your own being. That's when someone feels the difference. Not when you're performing love, but when you are love. Not when you're doing more, but when you are more, because you've returned to yourself. And in that return, you become unforgettable. Not because you chased connection, but because you became the kind of presence people don't know they're missing until it's gone.